and gentlemen, thank you. It is my honor and privilege to introduce to you Erin Betsky, who is the president of the School of Architecture of Taliesin. On a personal note, I teach a class at Taliesin West in the summer, and have the privilege of having him join us for dinners periodically and having great discussions with our students about design and things like that. So I really appreciate that part of our relationship. But many of you know him as the author of more than a dozen books on subjects including modernism, architecture, and design. He writes a twice weekly blog for architectmagazine.com called Beyond Buildings. He's trained as an architect and in the humanities at Yale University. He was previously the director of the Cincinnati Art Museum from 2006 to 2014, and the Netherlands Architecture Institute from 2001 to 2006, as well as a curator of architecture and design at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art from 1995 to 2001. He was also the director of the 11th Venice International Biennial Architecture, and his latest books, Making It Modern and Architecture Matters, were published last year. So Mr. Betsky is well-versed in design and architecture, and again, the president of Taliesin School. So I know that some of you have a 6 o'clock class, and just when you leave, please do so as quietly as possible. I've warned him that that's the case, that some of you may be leaving. And those of you who are looking for that bonus for your test from last week from my class, please sure you sign up on my notepad that's running around here. So with that, I will introduce to you Erin Betsky.
Is that turned on? Oh, yes.
Yes, you are definitely turned on.
I am live. Thank you, Sue-Ann. I'm very happy to be here. I heard all about this place, of course, from Sue-Ann and the students, and Austin and Porter gave me a great tour today. Are there any of the other students from, oh, thanks. Any of the other students from, I'm not seeing anyone.
Andy was here, was with us.
Oh, yes, hi. Okay. So it's very pleasant to be here indeed.
This is his first time to San Antonio. So.
It is, yeah, it is. I think I've now been to every major city in Texas, so it's a trifecta or whatever it is. Anyhow, what I want to talk to you about today is architecture. Now, that might seem obvious, but what I'm not necessarily going to talk to you about is buildings. And that might seem confusing because we often get architecture and buildings confused. We often think of them as being the same thing. But actually, buildings are buildings. A building is a building, and building is the act of making buildings. And architecture is everything that is about buildings. It's how we design buildings, how we make buildings, how we think about buildings, how we talk about buildings. It is, if you will, the meta of buildings. Now, by that token, the best representation, the biggest fulfillment of architecture is in buildings. The problem is that, sorry, I'm dealing with a small crisis back in Taliesin. The problem with that is that buildings are also the tomb of architecture. So if you just look around this room, and I have done this more than once, so I'm not picking out just this one room. But if you wanted to try to figure out where the architecture was in this room. Now, if you go outside, this building is definitely trying very hard to be architecture, right? It's definitely like, let's put a curve here, let's put an angle here, let's change materials, let's turn around, let's have new materials there. Look, Mom, no hands. So it's trying very hard to show that it's architecture. But you come in here and you go, where's the architecture? And those of us that are architecture nerds would go, well, it's the angles, and the angles have to do with the acoustics, and it's the proportions, and maybe it's even the colors, and the searching here. And pretty soon, even if the architects would have some sense of what we were trying to talk about, the people who weren't in architecture would be completely lost, because it's very difficult to find what those qualities are that make something architecture within a building. Not only that, but it has become increasingly difficult to do so in the last few decades. The architect Cesar Pelli, who is one of my mentors, and I guess who designed the downtown Shard building, famously said that an architect gets 1/4 of an inch. Everything else is established by economics, is established by codes, and then you get the 1/4 of an inch of the facade, and that's what you can play with. That might be optimistic, because more and more, everything about a building is set not by the desire of the architects, but by codes. Of course, by building codes and by life safety codes that define much of the building, but certainly also by financial codes that leach any investment out of a building as quickly as is absolutely possible, because you want to get your capital in, get it back out again as fast as possible. And certainly also by computer codes, which by now are not just facilitating the design of buildings, but are actually guiding it in semi-invisible ways through a process of BIM, but also through the whole bestiary of rhinos and all the other supposed helpmates that in fact define much of what turns into architecture. And then of course, there's also codes of behavior, cultural codes that also define architecture. And the result of that is that it's more and more difficult to find architecture in buildings. Now, where do we then look to find architecture? Well, my argument is that we need to go beyond buildings. We need to go in buildings, we need to go outside of buildings, we need to think of an architecture of an imagination, an architecture that inheres and is also diffused through the whole city. I just walked around San Antonio today, and like I'm sure most visitors, it's hard not to be charmed. But there are not that many great buildings. There certainly was a pretty good stock of buildings in the 20s, 30s, and there are, from every decade, 1 or 2 good buildings. But most of what creates the attraction about a place like this is the relationship between the buildings, the urbanism. We just went to see, thank you Austin and Porter, we went to see today Trinity College, and the buildings themselves are about what I expected. They're beautiful pieces of modernism with really bad detailing, but the landscaping is really what ties them all together. It's their situation, it's the relationship among them that makes them so good. And I'm here talking about very special circumstances, because of course most American cities, most American campuses, and even in San Antonio, as soon as you get outside of the Centro Storico, you get nothing but crap, right? You get horrible stuff. Frank Gehry is famous for saying, and you'll forgive my language here because I'm quoting him literally, 98% of everything that's built out there is shit. And that might be optimistic. It is incredible how bad most of the buildings are that surround us. And yet, somewhere in the landscapes, in the way we use them, in the way that we move through them, we can find something there that might allow us to think of it as architecture. Now, what do I then mean by architecture? I mean the ability to create a structure, a framework, a stage, a scaffolding, in which we as human beings can come to a free and open relationship to other beings we call humans, and in which we can establish a clear relationship with a world, whether human-made or natural, that we understand as the stage, as a place in which we act. A very general definition. But that particular ability is being carried out, I would argue, on all kinds of post-building levels. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk to you about. And I know that some of you have to leave soon, so let me start to show some pretty pictures. Is there any way of turning on the lights a bit so you can all go to sleep? Get a quick nap. So, having said all this, this is the most important building of the last 20 years, right? It's the most perfect building of the last 20 years. It's the omega of architecture. It is the perfect circle that stands at the end of the progression of architecture. It is also the headquarters of one of the most important companies in the world, Apple Computers, created by one of the lords of high tech, Lord Foster, although, sorry, he lost his lordship because he moved to France for tax reasons, Sir Foster. And it just is so perfect in every way in which it appears. It is Dilbert land turned into an endless raceway that's so transparent that people keep running into its walls. It's the perfect emblem of how all architecture comes together, the panopticon with, I am sure, Steve Jobs buried right in the middle so that he can still keep track of all of his employees creating those most beautiful, perfected objects. This is what, if you have about $1 billion, a pretty good architect, and a client who goes along with everything, you can do with a building. It's perfect, except it isn't. Because even before it was finished, they had to build this piece of shit just down the road because the program changed. Because it turns out that creating that kind of a static building in a world in which everything changes continually, a world of modernity marked by the continual movement of people and goods and information, creating a building that is so enclosed and static is useless. It will and has become a relic, an emblem of a bygone ambition for a company that has already changed radically. But of course, that is in and of itself just a symptom. It's a symptom of that continual flow of people and goods and information that has been put into hyperdrive through the incredible growth of interconnected communication and communications technologies that, of course, the objects that Apple makes or has made in China are emblematic of. We live everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We live in a world in which we are connected through all kinds of devices in which we actually spend a great deal of time not in one physical place. And if I can throw down a challenge, I've been throwing this down for the last couple of years because I still haven't seen it. If anyone wants to make the big breakthrough in architecture, somebody please figure out how to make architecture out of Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tinder, Grindr, TikTok, Telegraph, everything like that. If you can turn that into architecture, you might be onto something, because of course the reaction to all of this is to say, oh, that's not architecture. That's just technology. But in fact, it is emblematic of a problem that is very real for architects. So if you keep questioning, why can't we make a perfect building? And then if we make a perfect building, why doesn't it work? And then if you think about the economic and social logic that is leaching architecture out of buildings, then you very quickly arrive at sprawl, at the concatenation of human dwellings that reaches from here to Timbuktu, that is not only taking over landscape, but also destroying the cities themselves, that is economically unjust, disassociating people from sources of income, education, and opportunity, segregating people, enclosing people, and of course environmentally devastating in the way that it is completely destroying what we haven't already done away with on our planet. And sprawl is not just an American phenomenon. It happens all over the world, whether it's in Taiwan or whether it's in Tokyo, whether it's in Santiago, Chile, where I was just a few weeks ago, or whether, of course, it's right here in San Antonio. Sprawl is everywhere all around us. And sprawl is not just a question of the spread of human dwellings across a large landscape. It is also the falling apart of the elements that make up sprawl, the inability to define the true edges of either buildings or property, the complete takeover of that landscape by ticky-tacky anonymity, gimcrackety built and completely interchangeable, dominated by huge signs. Anyone know what this is from?
Breaking Bad.
Yes, all right. Someone here is woke. Well, they're not woke. They're television addicts. Anyhow, when I went to find these slides, I Googled sets, Breaking Bad. And instantly, I got not one, but two services that would give me a guided bus tour of the sites of Albuquerque where Breaking Bad was filmed, which is, of course, exactly the irony. Because the point of Breaking Bad and its power is that there can be a guy dying of cancer cooking meth in one house, and there can be a safe suburban family with 2 kids in a monogamous relationship in the next one, and there could be 6 immigrants crammed together in one house in the next one, and there can be an illegal seamstress in the other one. I have my pants altered in a building just like this. Anything can be anything, and everything can be anywhere, and none of it coheres except through fear. Through the systems of paranoia, the tyranny of defense that tries to make sure that this illusion of a safe world cannot be damaged. And of course that means that everywhere at all times, Big Brother is watching us. I'm looking for it. I'm not seeing it, but I bet you somewhere here Big Brother is watching us. Because, or Big Sister is always watching us everywhere at all times. And of course, all of this might just be a consensual hallucination in which we are just in pods being leached of our vital bodily fluids for the power of some unknown race. And that's not just science fiction. When you think about everything in this room, about the carpet, the lay-in ceiling tiles, the fake wood, it's all chemical recombinations, most of it based on oil, that reduces itself to completely artificial combinations that did not exist 30 or 40 years ago. We live in a hallucination in which that's a white wall rather than having studs and electrical lines and all kinds of other unknown stuff within it. We live in an illusion of solid buildings that in fact are just nodes of coherence within this world of sprawl. So what are we supposed to do? Well, the easiest thing to do, of course, is to go with the flow. To say we can, in fact, change ourselves and our buildings, our perceptions at a chemical level. Or quite literally, we can reassemble our world by taking all of the endlessly fluid aspects of our existence, from babies' toys to dildos, and combine them all into buildings that might be not much more than illusionary projections as in the world of the triple O'ers and Mark Foster Gage. Has triple O hit here yet? Everyone gotten triple O here yet? No. No object-oriented ontology in this architecture school? Man. All right, better get hip. It's actually, never mind, it's already passed. It was like hip in New York for about a year or two, and then in LA for about a year or two. So you can skip it and try to figure out what the next thing is. Anyhow, object-oriented ontology, or triple O, is what produces this kind of work. We all live in a hyperobject. We cannot know that hyperobject. Any of its truth or its reality recedes unless it is broken or fragmented. And if it is, then we only gave a temporary and highly skewed perspective into this hyperobject that will dissolve and turn into something else as soon as we look at it. Here, there you go, triple O in 2 sentences. So go with the flow. And of course, we have all the tools to be able to do that. We can create forms that bulge and blow themselves out in all kinds of bizarre ways without having any need to worry about gravity or occupation or any of the traditional modes in which architecture is supposed to look at. And if you think that's all just science fiction, of course by now, after 20 years of having that bestiary in the zoo that is our computer, we can create just about anything that we can imagine. This is the new high-speed train station in Kowloon, which arches over a 8-story tall chasm in which the trains connect you to Shanghai in about 2 hours, and vaults up to a outside park that goes about 8 stories above the ground, providing you this spectacular view of Hong Kong. Of course, Zaha Hadid's office and UN Studio can do these absolutely spectacular renderings of a fluid architecture that sprawls and blobs and responds to the fluidity of the movement of people and objects and information, except that ultimately it's still a shopping mall, a hotel, high-rise condominium, and an office building, just with a kind of bodywork that would not look so bad on an Audi. And when someone doesn't know what they're doing, it turns into a really bad Hyundai, and then rises 80 stories above Macau in this kind of curse upon everything around it. So I'm more interested in using the computer to get it wrong, to figure out how to take things apart and recombine them, how to create possible structures, not by imagining something that perfectly embodies, enjoy your class, guys.
Thank you very much, sir.
I'll tell you about everything you missed later. No, more of it. God. Oh, I'm hurt. No. Possible architectures that use the elements of the past in order to create a possible present as well as a possible future. And it is something that by now is entering into the reality of architecture. We can scan, we can collect, we can create not a Maya moment, but a Photoshop reality that is gathered together from images that we can then 3D print in just about any material we can imagine. And you can go even further and imagine that we could have this. Anyone know what this is? See how well you've got your art history. Not the professors. I'm assuming you're the professor. Students, anybody? Sue Ann, you got some work to do.
I guess so.
What's that?
I said, I guess we do.
It's the Larkin Building by Frank Lloyd Wright in Buffalo, New York. One of the greatest office buildings. You knew that, right? One of the greatest office buildings ever done. Except it's not there. It was torn down about 25 years after it was built. But here, in this absolutely photorealistic rendering, we have that building back. Now, 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago, if you showed this to me, I would say, oh God, this is the worst, this is fake news, this is pretending that something that is gone is now here again. And now, I'm beginning to wonder, since we can create anything we can imagine, and since we can redefine our histories, why not create this kind of a structure? What would be so bad about rebuilding this particular building? What would be so bad about a critical repurposing of elements from all around us, in which the reality of things, whether in terms of construction or of function, is ultimately undecidable? The firm MVRDV has been doing some wonderful experiments in this area. They were asked to design a new shop for the fanciest shopping street in Amsterdam, AC Hoofd Street. And they said about it, and then the local zoning board said, no, 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 no. It says right here that even though the building was torn down, you have to rebuild it exactly the way it was, and it has to have all of the proportions and elements of the existing buildings. So NVRDV took a big sigh and then read the zoning ordinance very carefully and found out that, guess what? It said brick, but it didn't say what the bricks had to be made out of. So they figured out a way to make glass bricks that are exactly the same proportion as the original bricks, that they had to glue together using dental glue, with dental assistants with lasers, bonding them all together, so that they could create a whole building that completely dissolved. And then one of the partners in the firm, Vinnie Maas, got a call from the small town in which he was born up, Schendel, grew up, which he was born and grew up, called Schendel, tiny little town. And they called him and said, Mr. Maas, when you were 9 years old, you made a drawing of our town square and sent it to the mayor and said, our town square is awful and here's what it should look like. Respectfully yours, Vinnie Maas. Now you're a famous architect, and we've kept that drawing, and you know what, you're right, and we do need to redo the city square, and we'd like you to come back and do it. Oh, but by the way, here's the problem. The only way to pay for it is to put a shopping mall on the square. Oh, and by the way, no one wants a shopping mall. Everyone hates it. So give us a shopping mall that goes away. So Vinnie Maas went to Schendel, working with a really good photographer. They documented every single building in this small village, took photographs of it, put it all on the computer, photoshopped it together to create the perfect Schendel building, the building that epitomized everything in that little town. And then they blew it up 120% so that it could fit all of the program of the shopping mall, and then they printed it on glass so that you have a building that is illusionary, a building that is there but isn't there, a building in which the architecture, traditional, but also the fabric of a completely new special printed glass, hovers somewhere at the edges of appearing and disappearing. And that's something that is becoming more and more of a focus for me. How do you find an architecture where seemingly it would be impossible? Where can we still find architecture in this sprawling world, this world of fake news and of a social world that's dissolved into all of our networks? And I look at this great image of this modernist ideal of the perfect white rectangle, that emblem of nothing, of the perfection of abstraction. In these photographs by the Japanese photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto, in this series he took of theaters, And he took the photographs by leaving the aperture open while the whole movie was playing, so that all of the car chases, all of the love scenes, all of the arguments, all of the fights, all dissolved into pure nothing. And you're left contemplating the fact that all of that complex reality dissolves the more you look at it. Except, the more you look at it, your eyes start wandering. They start wandering to the edges of the frame. They start picking up the reflected light on all of these magnificent details. They start noticing what remains, what is still there, what we inherited, what still has some form of solidity to it. Architecture functions at its best today as a ghost, as a memory, as a reminder, as a fabric, as a specter, as something that perhaps only coheres through its association with everything that is around it, everything we imagine, everything that has come before it. Architecture exists only if you look very hard at what is already there and start to notice what is not there, what is not quite right, what is articulated, what has been moved, what has been blown up, what has been resolved, how architecture somehow reconstructs itself out of its bones, out of its skeleton, making possible the continual move of cars, of stores, of pop-ups, of living, of parties in this highly flagellated and distended parking garage designed by Herzog de Meuron. I give you here the counter to the Apple headquarters. After the Apple headquarters was announced, Mark Zuckerberg, one of the other evil overlords of the digital world, went searching for an architect to do his headquarters. That, of course, had to be bigger and better than the one that Steve Jobs was designing. So he went all around the world looking at different architects' work. He walked into Frank Gehry's office, looked at the messy array of desks that grouped around into teams and model-making areas in this renovated tilt-up slab warehouse from the 1980s, and said, I want this. Just give me this. And I need 2 million square feet of it to start out with. And then maybe 3, and now they're up to close to 4 million square feet of just endless warehouse, of a recreation of renovation, a completely rough assemblage of stuff that is shot through with a memory of what creates structure and coherence. And it turns out that if you really want to make architecture that works, that presents itself as architecture, that performs as architecture, that has the power of architecture, that has the beauty of architecture, that has the openness of architecture, then digging in to the fabric of what exists, reusing, rethinking, reliving, reanimating what we already have, turns out to be a very powerful tool. As Sue Ann said, I had the honor of directing a Venice Architecture Biennale, which is a great thing, and if any of you ever have a chance, save all your money and go to Venice, go see a Biennale. It's the greatest thing you'll ever do, especially since I'm not doing it anymore. But after I did it, a few years later, Aravena came in, and he noticed what I had failed to notice, which was the tremendous waste that went into the construction of these exhibitions. And as his first statement, at the beginning of this long road that goes for 1/3 of a mile through a medieval rope factory, he created a room that presented all of the bits and pieces of the last Biennale, assembled into this room that completely surrounded you. All of which is a very simple way to say that if I was king for a day, heaven forbid, I would make one rule. no more buildings. We don't need any more new buildings. We have enough buildings. We have enough stuff. What we need to do is to reuse, rethink, reanimate what we already have. Before we reach a point in which we have used up all of the natural resources that we cannot replenish and have transformed every square inch of space in the world into a chemical recombination of artificial materials, we should first reuse and rethink what we already have. It's an imperative. I used to think, oh well, I'll be dead by the time all this climate change gets to be such a big problem. Let the next generation worry about it, right? I'm one of those people that Greta thinks caused it all. But of course it's happening right now, and it's very real. And we will not have a world in which we can exist. The world will actually still exist. We just won't be able to exist within it. This shit is real. I mean, this is a reality. Before, after, and during everything else, we can no longer afford to have a discipline of architecture based on using natural resources, based on urban growth, based on all of the things that are a major contribution to destroying a planet in which we are guests. We just cannot do this. And there is no such thing as a net zero building. Because even if your building is net zero or net positive, what it takes to assemble that building, to make that building, will still be destructive of our environment. So we have to turn to reuse, to rethink. Now obviously, that's not necessarily something new in any sense of the word. And it's been going on for quite some time. What's especially interesting to me is that the most flavorful, the most expressive, the most exciting renovations are those that are transforming the places where we used to make all that stuff, where we used to produce the goods and the pollution that has destroyed our planet, into places of experience, of gathering, of coming together, of community. Whether it's 798 Factory in Beijing or the Zollverein in Germany, outside of Essen, that has taken an old coal mine and steel plant and turned it into a place for beer gardens and swimming pools and museums and schools and everything else that is reanimating that whole part of the Ruhr Valley. This is one of my favorite recent projects when I went to see in China. This was at one point the largest steel mill in the world, decreed by Mao to be exactly the largest steel mill in the world. And it's now being turned into the headquarters for the 2022 Beijing Olympics, with all of the buildings opened up, cut through, reassembled, and reanimated through all these uses. The core of this kind of thinking actually goes back to the world of industrial design. It was first developed by a group that called themselves Droog Design, or Droog Design, when they went to the Milan Fair in 1993, and said, we have enough stuff, we don't need more stuff, we don't need to just streamline things, we don't need to hide things by putting pretty curves on them. What we really need to do, what's that?
Amber Alert.
Oh, okay. I was like, do we need to get out of here? What we really need to do is take a bunch of rags and pile them up together so they make a chair. Or take a bunch of leftover bricks and create a structure out of them. What we can do is create chest of drawers out of leftover pieces we find at the flea market. Or we can bring together 100 light bulbs to create a chandelier and reassemble them into new objects. And that is an attitude that now pervades much of the world of industrial design as well as much of the world of art. And this is probably the most famous architect who's not an architect working today. Anyone know who this is? Yes, all right. Someone knows this. Virgil Abloh, amazing guy, got an engineering degree from Wisconsin, went to graduate school at IIT, learned all his Miesianisms, but while he was doing that, he was going to clubs, DJing, doing all that stuff, maneuvered himself to meet Kanye West, became Kanye West's sort of style guru, then started his own fashion company by taking a bunch of leftover Ralph Lauren polo shirts and putting on the front Pyrex, as in something modern and highly chemical, something that speaks of the future, and on the back the name 23. You can answer this. 23 for? Yes, Michael Jordan. All right, because he's a Chicago boy. And then went on to design shoes and fashion, and now working with IKEA, working with Vitra, doing all kinds of things. The only thing he's not doing is buildings. He's creating fashion, art, music, installations, just about everything you can imagine, except for buildings, because buildings are too slow. Buildings are not really necessary for him. What you're seeing, in other words, is people blowing up and reassembling buildings, taking them apart, taking elements of Ming Dynasty temples and creating new structures out of them, salvaging materials from wherever they can find them to create new buildings. And what interests me most about this work is not necessarily the reuse itself in the most expedient manner. What interests me is the fetishism of it. The attitude that uses that act of assembly and reuse as a way to wake us up, as a way to make us aware of where we are, and perhaps thereby who we are, where we've come from, and where we're going. This is the Cap Street project by the San Francisco artist Doug Arland, who took an old piece of workers' housing and slowly, year by year, began stripping away the wallpaper, shellacking it, stripping away some more, putting on beeswax, finding implements and assembling them, marking the points where the safe got away and cracked the wall, and turning the whole building into a relic of its own existence. It's an attitude that's being carried forward today by artists like Theaster Gates here in the Huguenot project in Munster, Germany. And of course, it's also being carried forward now by architects who use the act of renovation as a form of revealing, a form of revelation, a form of transforming what Frank Lloyd Wright used to call the gutter rats of architecture, the leftover bits and pieces, the most humble materials, and in their isolation, turning them into objects, not just of contemplation, not just of use, but of great beauty, of things that astonish us by the way that they stand as relics. You know, we went to see some of the missions today, and of course, the ruinous quality is what gives them their particular power. Here's a young firm in Belgium who takes existing buildings and slices them, dices them, opens them up, recombines them. This is a former psychiatric institute where they found it as a ruin and found a client who believed that you had to make an architecture that would allow the patients to figure out where they were, to find themselves, to articulate themselves through these very gossamer structures threaded through the ruins of the existing buildings. On a more mundane level, it's an architecture that recombines the cast-off elements of everyday life and the remains of existing buildings. There's a firm called 2012 Architects who has created software called the Harvest Map, in which they've created an ability for you to find and assemble anything in your area that could possibly be used to reassemble a building, whether it's leftover kitchen sinks or pieces of drying machines, whether it's truck tires or car seats. They can all be the elements, the building blocks for a new architecture. This is Wade Guten's Heidelberg project in Detroit, where he started by finding the abandoned buildings right in the middle of Detroit. My mother grew up about 2 blocks from here. She insisted on going to see it and found, of course, that everything in her block was long gone. And Guten took those fragments that were left, not just of buildings, but of toys, of memories, of leftover bits and pieces, and began to create a memory palace out of them, something that would allow us, or allow the people there, to remember what was there and to begin to construct a new future. It inspired a whole number of artists and architects in that area who are now taking what is left in order to use that as building blocks for a new kind of community that could arrive here. This is a wonderful artist called Marianne Theeuwens, who takes buildings that are about to be demolished and works with community action groups to try to repurpose them. When they can't be repurposed, when they lose the battle, she does her last work of art, which is to take all of the elements of those buildings and recombine them, stack them, assemble them, and then take photographs of them that become the architecture, that become the memory, that become the way that we understand these places as possible future structures, even if the physical buildings are destroyed. Here's Leonardo Drew taking fragments from all around his daily life and assembling them into artworks. You can take everything that is around you, and by dragging it out, by reassembling it, by using the tradition of collage, you can begin to create a building blocks for a new architecture. This is Studio Drift, who took all of the materials in a VW Bug and compressed them into blocks according to the size and weight in which they existed in the car, and then proposed a new urbanism based on those various elements. You can even just take the breath and piezoelectric energy that come from the body and turn it into a forest through which you can walk. This is one of my favorites. This is Francois Roche, who is completely crazy, I mean, probably clinically crazy, but here who proposed creating a perfect museum building for Bangkok, a completely transformed blobular object that would be a museum that would be electrostatically charged so that it would collect all of the pollution of Bangkok, at the same time making it visible and using it to create a collective cloak, an architecture around the functional building. Mark Bradford, an artist working in Los Angeles, went around for this series to the neighborhood in which he lived in South Central LA and picked up fragments of posters, lost cat, boxing match here, various other elements he found in the neighborhood, pasted them onto a canvas, slathered automobile paint on it, scraped it away, put on new posters, put on new automobile paint, scraped it away, put on more paint until what he wound up with was what he calls a map of Los Angeles, an assembly of his place that tells him where he is. If you like it, you can steal it. I hope that you learned that lesson in architecture school. And you can even just assemble a whole architecture, not just by reusing its physical forms, but also by reusing its plans. This is a wonderful project called, for reasons I have no idea, The Emperor of Ice Cream. Obviously a reference to the E. Cummings poem, but not quite sure why it's that. Anyhow, you can also do it digitally, of course, in the work of someone like Perry Culper. And as we become more and more facile with all these digital tools, we realize that we can take existing forms and images and just glitch them together. Somehow, you might not even have to do that much. It might be enough to just take leftover paving stones that you find in the back of a park in Germany, find a leftover statue and a beehive and combine them. Create a small amphitheater where a poet or an architect can gather a community around them. Here is an architect who decided that the best way to make architecture was during one of the climate, what's it called? What?
Marches?
Yeah, the climate, what's it called? The, not Earth Day, the,
Strike.
come on. Going blank here completely. The marches against what we're doing to our planet.
It's the global climate strike.
The strike, thank you, the climate strike. Yes, global climate strike. Decided to create a temporary structure out of leftover materials that could be a podium for declaiming the issue at hand. It might be as simple as just piling up a bunch of rocks along the site of a former railroad line in rural Sicily, in order to mark that particular place, or putting a staircase over another bunch of rocks in that same area. And of course, the best example of an architecture that has the ghost of memory within it, that opens up the world around us, is the High Line in New York. If the Apple headquarters was the most perfect piece of building, this is probably the most successful piece of architecture of the last 20 years. Successful certainly if you think economically, whether that's good or bad, because for an investment of about $100 million, they unlocked about $15 billion of real estate value in this part of Manhattan by taking an elevated train line and turning it into a snaking promenade that opens up views through the city, that unearths the former industrial plant, that has Pete Aldolf planting the seeds of the former flora of Manhattan, and that cuts right through the city to create a new perspective on our world. By opening up, by reusing, by creating open space rather than building, we become aware of where we are, and we create a new kind of community. In Mexico City, a very small percentage of your paycheck always goes to a national fund for social housing called Infonavit. And for years, they've been building hundreds of thousands of units of absolutely minimalist boxes in which they tried to cram people. A new director came in and said, you know what, we've produced more than enough of these. We actually have enough, but no one wants to live in them. They're horrible. What we need to do is extend them, renovate them, open them up, and create the kind of courtyards that actually turn them into communities filled with places to display sports and lending libraries and the other facilities that truly make this into a community. When I show this image, I'm always reminded of a story of a young firm who got a commission right out of school through a competition to design a new town square. And so they went to this small town, and being just out of school, they were very well trained. So they did all the right stuff. They collected the climate data, they collected the geological data, they studied the bus routes and the frequency with which people use them. They interviewed all the people there. They looked at the effect of rain and how the architecture had modeled itself according to the rain patterns. They studied every single inch of this site, and then they did a thick report, that thick, and all the way at the end of it they said, do nothing. Leave it exactly the way it is. Take care of it. Everything that you could do would detract from its usefulness. And here's our bill for 20,000 euros. So maybe architecture is about doing almost nothing, not in the way that Ludwig Mies van der Rohe proposed, but the way that this firm did in Barcelona. You know, Barcelona has this wonderful tradition of doing these grand public spaces that I certainly grew up with. But this is the latest public square, which is not in the fancy downtown area, but in a working class site outside of downtown that just happens to have a great view of the whole city. And it was a former gun emplacement that had been taken over by illegal housing, and these architects said, take away only that which keeps you from seeing the view, and add only that which will keep you from killing yourself. Hurting yourself is okay. We just don't want you to kill yourself. And create a place that gives you this incredible perspective, not only of the city, but also of the fragments and elements that make up the whole place. So all of this is to say that what I think we need is not building, but unbuilding. Not architecture, but as Audemars Clark, who did this, called it anarchitecture, an analogous architecture, an anarchist architecture, an architecture that is not quite architecture, but that is an opening up of existing buildings, that is revealing of what is hiding behind all those walls, that cuts away at all of the lies that our buildings actually represent, that destabilizes the relationship between what we think of as a neutral plane and the sensual and sinuous objects that confront us by peeling out from that anonymity. An architecture that goes into the guts of buildings, grabs its elements, repurposes them, misuses them, reuses them, calibrates them in order to create spatial effects that allow us to rediscover what we already knew. An architecture of misreading, of misuse, of deformation as well as of reformation. An architecture that might be no more and no less than a glitch in the system that allows us to see all of the irreality with which we've surrounded ourselves. An architecture that might even begin to reinstall in however fragmentary a manner the human body and humanity within buildings. This is a project that some of you might have seen before, some of you might even have seen it in one of the series of Homeland, where in Caracas, a skyscraper was never quite finished, 40 stories tall, and one night a bunch of squatters went in, occupied it up to the 25th floor. Urban Think Tank, a group of architects, went in there with a photographer, Iwan Bam, not to help that community figure out how to make it up to code, not in order to help them in any other way, but just to see it, to reveal it, to make us aware of how we can create communities and places within our existing structures, within our existing fabric. So if most people like to look up at the shiny new edifices that are rising around them, I'm more like these crazy Russian kids who break into the skyscrapers of Europe and Asia and the Arab Peninsula, climb up to the very top, dangle from the top spire, and then look down. Look at what's already there. Look at the vertiginous beauty of what we've created and its dangerous horror, and begin to figure out what we can do with that. Several years ago, I directed the Shenzhen Biennale, and we did exactly that. We tried to figure out how to take all of the elements that were already there to begin to rebuild the city, to take such simple artifacts as the plants and the aluminum foil that people used in order to make their offices more humane, and reinstall them to create another kind of place. A library of unreadable books, not just because they were in Chinese and most Westerners couldn't read them, but also because they were placed with their spines an architecture made by assembling what is left over, what is not valued, what we think of as ugly, what we think of as other, and using that to dress the bones, give reality to the specter of architecture. That is what I'm certainly trying to do with some of my work here, an image I made together with one of our students. And that's certainly what we're trying to do at Taliesin, where we sit in the middle of some of the worst sprawl of America in what Frank Lloyd Wright called his winter camp, where he took the desert itself and folded it up into a new landscape and then spread temporary shelters over it, in which we now work and design and talk and try to figure out where we are. And in the other 6 months of the year, we're at the original Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, where we sit in this artificial forest trying to be the best experimental architecture school in the country. We use and abuse all those beautiful structures. We're crawling our way towards some new form of spatiality. We take the elements of Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. These are bits and pieces of everything from the Roby House to the Guggenheim Museum, and reassemble them into new forms. We take the very idea of building blocks, textiles blocks, work with some of the Native American tribes in the area, and with the latest CNC milling to begin to create new building blocks for new kind of architecture. We take the very nature of sprawl, investigate its elements, create a new kind of order out of all of its fake materials, and then finally address the place where we actually live. At the core of what we do at Taliesin is the building of shelters. Every student, before they graduate, has to design, build, and occupy their own shelter, and then create a thesis based on that about how we can live in our modern world. This has been going on for years, and the result has been a whole series of experiments in form and material, and in how temporary and basic you could make our shelters. This is a student who graduated about 3 years ago, getting his final crit from Todd Williams and Billy Sin, who told him to change it all. Luckily, he didn't listen to them. This is a student from Chile creating what he called atalaya, a crow's nest in the middle of the desert. And this was a student who graduated a little less than a year ago, who went back to the original desert shelters that were done there in the time of Frank Lloyd Wright. They were based on the idea of creating desert masonry, which is the rocks in the area assembled with as little concrete as possible to create a base, and then a shepherd's tent, a pyramidical shepherd's tent, placed on top of that. Except, if you look very carefully, this guy, who happened to have worked for NPRDV, built the whole thing out of fake materials. The stone is actually the pattern of stone, the photographs of stone, printed on glass. And the tent is actually a fabric material that is photographed and printed on metal, so that at night the whole thing becomes this tenuous object that glows where it should be solid and is solid where it should be translucent. More recently, another student who worked for Mark Foster Gage began to try to make a desert masonry using not just the stones, but all of the leftovers that human beings have placed in that desert, from tire trucks to satellite dishes to bottles to anything that he could possibly find. Another student took all of the wood that would normally be used to make a single-family home, and in a rhetorical fashion misused it, create this much more solid object. Another student created an open skeleton, a framework that would allow for different forms of social gathering. And here is the project by Connor Dennison, who designed it out of rammed earth in such a way that it will last no more than 3 to 5 years. so that it encourages animals to live in it, so that it will fall back into the desert out of which it was assembled, while in the meantime giving us a sense of architecture, a memory of something beautiful that is created by reusing the material that is all around us. So that's what we're trying to do at Taliesin. We're trying to figure out how we can make that sprawling reality all around us more sustainable, more open, and beautiful. Please come see us there. Thank you. Sure. I'm happy to answer questions.
If anybody has any questions, I can pass the mic around.
Hi, thank you so much for that great lecture. I really enjoy reading your articles in Architect. I have a question about being an architecture critic. Do you get to visit all the places you review about? And if you don't, how does that change the way you review them?
I make it a rule only to write about things that I've actually seen. Have I broken that rule? Yeah, once or twice, but only if I have a reason that I'd seen it under construction or something of that sort. But yeah, it's difficult. Of course, that doesn't count for things that are theoretical. But yeah, I think that not just for architecture, but for many other cultural forms, the experience of it is important not just because of the coherence of the object, but because so much, especially of architecture, depends on its very complex relationship to the life in and around it. Not just the context, but the complexity of the social economic structures all around it. And of course, if you go to visit a place very quickly, you don't get all of that, but at least you understand the relationship of what is coherent to everything of which it's a part. So yes, you have to see that.
Have you been to the Pearl?
Yes, I was at the Pearl this morning, and it's it's a good man bun haven. I thought that some of the way in which the structure was over-articulated was quite powerful and quite beautiful. Some of it, the newer pieces, some of them seemed a little weak compared to what was rescued from the old, but they were quite powerful. So if you sort of suspend your disbelief or your social criticism about the narrowness of the social economic group it addresses, it's very successful in spatial terms. So I was impressed. Yes?
In the 1990s, Michael Benedict put together a book called Cyberspace: First Steps. He speculated that the digital world would make the real world more real because the digital world was going to become more virtual, as the language he was using then. And you seem to have a lot of correlation with that, but you're not exactly representing that mentality.
No, because I think that it's without a doubt that the ephemeral quality of the world all around us has led people to look for quote-unquote real experiences, for real food, for real materials, for suspension of all of that stuff. But the problem is that it has led to an over-romanticization of that reality, to a fetishization of it as being real, when of course it's just as much a construction of very complicated complicated assemblies as anything that human beings make. And so it winds up becoming a fake nature, if you will. And it also, I think the other difficulty is that it's become the new luxury. So the more money you have, the more real leather you can have, the more acreage you can have that screens out all of sprawl, the more you can have food that is being hand assembled by 30 different workers picking all the lettuces and getting them exactly right. So I think the prediction was true. I'm just not sure it's gone in the right direction.
So you talked about not building new buildings.
Mhm.
How would you address problems like overcrowding and population, huge populations in India with your idea of rethinking and reusing?
It's a good point, but it turns out that even in Mumbai, where there was a study recently, there's a huge amount of structures. It's just they're allocated in very strange ways. This is not true everywhere in India, by the way. You're absolutely right. There are parts of the world, including large parts of India and China, where there is a dearth of decent housing, etc. But many of those home places already have too many office buildings, too many other structures. They also have a situation in which very rich people can have 10,000 square foot houses, or the famous billion-dollar high-rise in Mumbai for one family. So there's a misallocation of physical resources. So I completely agree that my rhetorical rule that we should not make any more buildings is rhetorical, and there are exceptions. But I think quite often, the harder you look at a situation, the more you find not a lack of building, but a lack of the allocation of buildings, or a wasteful use of existing buildings. One last question, okay?
Okay, I don't know if I'm gonna be going up an alleyway. I'm curious about your idea of unbuilding.
Uh-huh.
You're sort of talking about unbuilding. I'm wondering if you're taking that further, once we've unbuilt,
Mm-hmm.
what's remaining? What is in the, where's the human and where's the scale?
That's a very good question. The phrase comes from Gordon Mother Clark, who believed that all of his work was community-based. Beyond the cutting open of buildings, his other major work was this food collective called EAT that sought to bring people together around the idea of food as art, and art as community, and community as being based around the most basic human needs, food. And he saw his cuttings and his spirals as a way to create a relationship between the individual body and what it was usually closed off from by walls. And particular in the spiral cuttings, he was very interested in a scale that went all the way from what a hand can touch, and the fact that by cutting open a bean and revealing its grain, you could understand how it not only was made but fit together with the bean next to it, and how that would then spiral all the way out from the scale of the room and the disruption of the ritual use of the room to the scale of the city. And that's something that Theaster Gates has picked up on as well. So I think that that form of unbuilding is a way of creating the relationships between the various scales of social relations and of physical relations that I think will allow us to weave together a new reality out of what already exists. Now, there's a much more pragmatic issue, which is the more you take away, of course, the less you have to use. So the question is rather to see unbuilding not as destruction, but as the editing or selective removal of what already exists. Does that answer that?
Yeah,
All right.
I mean, you could go anywhere with that sort of broad
Yeah,
question.
that's true. It's true. All right, time for beer?
Thank you so much.
All right, thanks. Thank you.